Good afternoon, YouTube. TK here, and today we are taking another tour of an Aussie junkyard. Aussie, that's the word. Today we're going to be looking at not Mitsubishis, but Nissans. Now, Australia always got an interesting mix of Nissans, very different from America, fairly similar to Europe, fairly similar to the New Zealand market stuff, definitely different from what you got in Japan. So today we're going to take a walk through, take a look at some of the classic hits of the Nissans that were sold in Australia, particularly the yellow ones. Beautiful color. And yeah, basically talk some history, talk some cars. I've walked away from all the ones I know anything about. Let's start here with the Pulsar Q. Now, Q is just a trim designation. This is just a Nissan Pulsar from the late 1980s. Now, if you've seen my previous video on Holdens, you know that Nissan actually used to sell these to Holden, which would then rebadge them as, I believe, the Astra in the 80s. But it was a Nissan design, it was a Nissan car. Nissan sold it in some pretty garish colors. I mean, I love colors on cars, but that blue is kind of horrible on this design. And it was a basic front wheel drive hatchback, little 4-cylinder engine under the hood. I believe these had a 1.6 liter. I'm a little hazy on exactly what generation engine that is. And so it turns out there's a good reason why I'm unfamiliar with this engine in this Pulsar. For the Australian Nissan Pulsars of this generation, they actually used a GM engine called the Family 2 engine, available in 1.6 liter and 1.8 liter variations, because Holden was building these as well, or at least selling them. And so I guess it made sense to use a GM engine for some reason. So that's actually really interesting. It's a Nissan, but with a GM 4-cylinder. So you can see here, looking at the cam cover, it says injection, it says OHC, that's an overhead cam engine. 1988, the Pulsar was an economy car, it was front wheel drive, but it actually had pretty decent spec under the hood. You can see here, if you look at the manifold, you can see where your injectors went. Here you've got your injector connectors. That's 4 injectors. It actually had port injection, 1 per cylinder. You know, you could buy a Falcon in 1989 that only had central fuel injection. You were buying a Suzuki Sidekick, or whatever we called it here, in 1993. That thing was still carby. The Pulsar, fuel injection, 1988, no problem. Quite an odd little thing. Inside, this one looks pretty terrible, but for an economy car, you know, these had a pretty decent dashboard for the era, pretty decent interior. I rode in a few of these growing up. A friend of mine actually had the Holden badge version, and there was an amazing prank. It's a pretty typical high school prank. Someone jimmied the lock open, basically pushed the car around the corner from where he'd parked it. So he gets back and he's like, "Oh no, my car's been stolen." And it wasn't, it was just pushed around the corner. So sorry about that, Callum. I mean, it wasn't me, but probably felt a little bit mean seeing how you reacted. Regardless, moving on. One thing I will say that is interesting about these is these early ones, up until about 1992, 1993, they actually built these in Australia. Nissan had a plant in Victoria, if I remember correctly, and they operated that up until about 92, 93, and they were building the Pulsars locally. After that date, they kept bringing in Pulsars. They were imported, obviously, but they actually had Australian-built Nissans once upon a time. It's funny to think about. We don't even have Australian-built Holdens anymore. Nissan really weren't afraid to get out there with the colors. This is obviously, someone's done a bit of a job on this, putting the black over the top. But the yellow, that is all original. Car companies used to know how to have fun. Oh, maybe it wasn't all original. Well, you could get these in yellow anyway, even if this one is fake. But you can tell that this is obviously someone's project. Oh my God. This is great. This is someone's Pulsar. They've basically turned it into a bit of a machine. They've ripped the back open. They've put like a little ute style bed in there. That's super cool. I love the grass, the black and yellow, the dodgy home paint job. It's all dodgy, but oh wow, that'd be perfect for attaching stuff on the roof. But that looks like a machine they had a lot of fun with. Yeah, I'm into that. I'm really into that. That is radical. Old-fashioned carby setup under the hood, not a lot of grunt out of this one, but still, I'm just, you know, you can see originally the car was white as well, but I just love what they've done with this thing. The grass is a hilarious touch. I actually kind of want to build something like this, because this just looks like an awesome place to hang out, even if it is currently jacked up a bit, but goddamn, what a little party machine. That's one to remember. So once upon a time, I actually spoke to a bunch of people that worked at Nissan Australia, and Interestingly, the Pulsar name, they said, was one of the most trusted names of all Australian nameplates back in like the mid 2000s or something. The problem was Nissan eventually ditched the name to go for the Tida name for their, you know, sort of mid-sized front-wheel driver, and that killed a lot of goodwill. But this was still called a Pulsar in 2006. I believe this had the QG engine, definitely not one of the Nissan favorites, but basically, again, just your sort of generic mid-sizer. Not very interesting, but then you could say that about a lot of Nissans of this period. Some people had the Nissan Sentra in the US. They loved it. You had the hot versions. It was a very cool car. I don't think anyone's ever really said that about the Pulsar, other than like the GTIR version, which was all-wheel drive and turbo. Most of them were pretty boring, but they were good, reliable transport that got you by. Another one of these here, fairly reliable, fairly nothing. Not a lot of stories told about them. So behind me here, we also have a Nissan Patrol, a dirty one that has had bedliner or something sprayed all over it. These were hugely popular. This generation was also sold, this boxy generation was also sold as the Ford Maverick, and another one of those Australian badge engineering jobs. Still built by Nissan, they just put Maverick badges on it, which was pretty cool. So that's the Ford Maverick Australia got. We never got the small ute. All right, what else we got here? We got another one of these 2000s Pulsars. That's about how boring they all looked. The old grandpa spec in white. Pretty dull. Again, back when America was loving the Sentra sedan in the 90s, you know, we had the Pulsar. This is a lift back one. You know, quite a bit different from what was in the American market, but it was a practical car. These were absolutely everywhere. You know, your gran probably had one, or, you know, your mate's gran, one of the two, and you can see the engine is actually in remarkably good condition there. No idea if it actually runs, but if you were going to pull an engine, I would pull that one because it looks better than all the others I've seen today. More Pulsar, more Pulsar. Now this one here, this is quite interesting. This is the NX Coupe. Little sporty front wheel drive thing. I believe a certain variant of these had an SR20 in it, or possibly a CA engine. Cool little thing, they looked cool, but being front wheel drive, a bit underwhelming. And unlike the Integra, unlike basically any Honda of the 90s, they didn't really have like a really cool Type R version. They didn't have one that was fast and handled well. They just had these generic ones that were a little bit underwhelming. They looked cool-ish, but they were, you know, barely any better than a Hyundai S Coupe. So what was the point? We got the Pulsar hatch behind me, you know, pretty bog standard. We also have the Nissan Pathfinder. These are actually pretty obscure here. Nissan sold a hell of a lot more Patrols than they did Pathfinders, just going off the top of my head. It's kind of a boxy, weird thing. I'm sure they were still pretty good off-road from what I've heard, but they just never really caught on. They were kind of awkward looking. People just went for the Patrol. It was kind of more, you know, akin to that big Land Cruiser that people loved. Now this one is going to be a favorite with all the Americans. It is the good old Nissan Maxima. Now we had these here with big V6 power. They never really caught on. These were probably as obscure, maybe a little bit less obscure than the Honda Accord here, which also didn't sell very much. You know, Australians, if they wanted a sedan, they weren't going for a Maxima. They were going for a Commodore, they were going for a Falcon, which you've seen in my other videos. Handsome cars, and, you know, people say the Maxima was a great handler, but, you know, Australians had rear-wheel drive. They weren't interested in front-wheel drive sedans, you know, except for the Magna, which was built locally and cheap, and they sucked in many ways. We also had the X-Trail. The X-Trail was huge. These were everywhere. They still are to some degree. I have a feeling they're actually lasting a little bit better than RAV4s of the same sort of early 2000s era, because a lot of those sort of get up 200, 3,000 kilometers and they just fall apart. That said, this X-Trail has clearly seen better days. But they're a handsome little boxy thing. Sort of handsome in exactly the way the Pathfinder wasn't, you could say. You often saw the X-Trail here with those chunky roof bars on top. You know, that's what Nissan was selling people, a rugged SUV, right when that craze was taken off. I say a rugged SUV, I mean a, you know, crossover. Fitting the X-Trail's vibe, like the whole thing was, it was kind of like a sporty SUV. So it had this, like, you know, panel here. This was meant to be easy to hose down. In the ads, they had a guy throwing a dirty mountain bike and he could just spray it all out. So yeah, it was basically very much a lifestyle vehicle in much the same way the RAV4 was supposed to be. And supporting that, just check out those gauges. That's actually kind of sick. A lot of cars got dodgy gauges in the 90s and 2000s. They looked real cartoony and stupid compared to like the more serious gauges of the 80s and 70s. But nah, the X-Trail did a good job. Look at that, there's your engine. What a peach. We got the X-Trail obviously with the QR engine. There is an SR20 VE or SR20 VET, if I remember correctly, turbo engine, which is one of the best SR20s ever produced that they put in a certain Japanese model of X-Trail. We did not get that. You can get them imported here. We got the more basic result, but hey, what are you gonna do? In here, we have an old school carby 4-cylinder transverse mount. And if we pull back, we see it lives in this brilliant golden machine. Nissan had some brilliant gold colors. I grew up, I had a Skyline in a similar color to this. Look at that. What I love about this is they didn't do the American thing of giving it a maroon interior. They gave it tan. It's filthy, but I tell you what, that gold paint, that's glorious. I believe they called this thing the Nissan Prairie, maybe because it was a dog. That's a bit mean, but I swear to God, back in the early 2000s, you got stuck behind one of these. I mean, you were stuck behind one of these. You were crawling along. Those old carby motors didn't do well once they got high up there in miles. Got another Maxima. It really is funny how big these are. And as many people in the US in the sports car and the car enthusiast scene tell me, oh, the Maxima was such a great car. To an Australian, they're just nothing, like not interested. Yeah, it's like when you got rear wheel drive, who cares, right? Now, we look under the hood there. That's a lovely looking V6. Is that the VG engine? I believe that would be the VG. You can see this one here has leather seats. It's a little bit nicer inside. It's actually quite nice inside. I think this is the thing. You know, people weren't really primed for like, wow, that radio was in great nick. But yeah, I think the deal here with Nissan was they wanted to sort of sell this like bit of a luxury sedan, but no one was buying a Nissan as a luxury sedan in Australia. That was the other problem. If you wanted a luxury sedan, you get a BMW or a Mercedes. You know, this didn't really feel like luxury to anyone. This is just a Nissan. And then it was like, why didn't you just buy a Commodore or a Falcon or a Statesman or a Fairmont? Just made no sense. Credit where it's due. Nissan did the colors well. Beautiful red. Got the GA engine under the hood. The 1.6, these also came in a 1.8. We didn't get any of the fancier, bigger engines, any of the faster ones. Next to it though, look at this. This thing is absolutely glorious. Now what you're looking at here is, and I could be wrong, but I believe this to be a Datsun 120Y. These were absolutely everywhere in the 90s. Not too many survived past it. There's a handful out there today and they're classics. You know, they're not just being driven around day to day. This one has obviously lived a hard life. You won't see too many of these coming into the wrecker's yard anymore. Look at those beautiful tail lights. Glorious. Yeah, you won't see any of these Datsuns coming in anymore. A rusty shell, I mean, sure, in better nick than this, but a rusty shell is worth more money than the $200 this place will give you. Not much left of her under the hood, but they never had much anyway. This one, at least by Australian standards, is too far gone to restore, but God, that little coupe, that's just glorious, isn't it? Now, this is one you may not have seen before. This is a Nissan Bluebird. Now, the Nissan Bluebird was originally sold in Australia by Nissan in the 80s. It's pretty popular. It was pretty similar to the Corolla wagons of the time and so on and so forth. But then they gave us this 90s one as well. So the Bluebird kind of fell into a weird spot. As a front-wheel drive sedan in the 90s, it didn't really fit in. It couldn't really compete with a Commodore or a Falcon, but then it was also below a Maxima. It was not really a competitor for the Camry. It just didn't really fit in anyway. There were a million better options. So they didn't sell very well. They looked kind of blobby. To be honest, they look like a great cousin of the Ford Taurus, which is another sedan that I just don't know why was ever sold in Australia. You can see here, it could actually be up optioned with some nicer equipment like the climate control, but fundamentally it was just a car that didn't really fit into the market well, didn't sell very well. Saw these around for a few years. There are very few left on the road today because they didn't sell a great many of them in the 90s. There wasn't a great reason to keep them around. Interesting to me that this one actually appears to have climate control, like automatic climate control, as opposed to just, you know, your normal 3-knob controls. I suspect that's because to try and make this thing compete, Nissan kind of tried to up equipment it, but just didn't work. This did come with a bigger engine than the Pulsar, a nice little 2.4 litre unit, but again, like in Australia, you're either driving your little 1.6 or your 1.8, or you're driving your 3.8 4-liter big sedan rear-wheel drive. You know, you're not, the 2.4 liter range, it kind of tells you like this car was in a middle ground that didn't make a lot of sense. It also highlights for me one of the things I sort of hate about covering Nissan in this era across the world, because Australia had the Pulsar, which was at once a Pulsar, then later it was a Tita, then it was a renamed Tita, and then it was a Sylphy, and then it was a Bluebird Sylphy or some other weird thing. You know, in the US, the Sentra wasn't really just a Sentra, it was these other 12 different models. It gets so confusing as you try to map it out across all these different nations and states, and it's just a mess. So when I say Pulsar, I'm talking like they put a Pulsar badge on it and sold it in Australia. Some of them were Pulsars, some of them were not. Now, the one thing we haven't seen up until now is a Micra, and they were everywhere once upon a time, but it looks like there just aren't any here, except for this one. Now, this is the rather glorious era of Micra. The one that kind of looked a little bit like a London taxi cab. I really liked these. My mother had one, I think, at one point. A friend of mine had one. The same guy that had the Astra that we moved around the corner, funnily enough. They hated it, like, oh, it looks too goofy, blah, blah, blah. I thought they looked really good. You know, they didn't look like every other hatch on the market. Nissan actually gave it some character. A little bit, you know, pretty typical for the time. Little, I think, 1.3 liter, maybe a 1.5 liter under the hood. The thing is, they were funky, and I tell you what, I love a funky car. I actually drove one, and it felt pretty good to me. Pretty swift, you know, pretty zippy for what it was. You could have them in manual. You know, what's to complain about? I actually don't know why this generation of Micra wasn't kind of more of an enthusiast car. I guess, like, you know, it was a subcompact, you know, it didn't really have a sports model or anything, but they're just so cute, and yet it didn't connect in the same way that the Fiat 500 did, you know, the Mini, a million other cars. Maybe they were goofy, maybe I'm just wrong, but I thought they looked pretty cool. This is a super interesting one and really quite obscure. So this one is one we definitely have to talk about. This is a Nissan Pintara from 1991. Now, the Pintara name actually first came here with the R31 Skyline. So Nissan had built the R31 Skyline in Australia. It also built the Pintara, which was just the same car with a 4-cylinder engine. It kept the Pintara name for a second generation, which was actually just an Australian-built Bluebird with front-wheel drive. It wasn't popular. They eventually turfed it. Australian-built and quickly forgotten. It's funny to think about Nissan in Australia because on the one hand, they've always sold pretty well here. They've been involved in V8 supercars on and off over the years. They were involved in Group A racing. They always sold pretty well. They were a part of the national landscape, and yet they're never really thought of in the same way as like Ford and Holden, and to a lesser extent Toyota and Mitsubishi, because they closed out in the 90s. They were out of here in like 93, 94 at best. That was it. That was the end of local manufacturing, and they were never really thought of as a local manufacturer because, I guess in part, yeah, they were building cars here, but they weren't building certain special Australian models. They were just building pretty regular cars. Mitsubishi left in like 2008. Toyota, Holden, Ford, all out the door in 2017. Those were big moments. Nissan leaving, I mean, I was very young at the time, but no one in my entire lifetime talked about it. It's only actually when I met people at Nissan Australia that I realized Nissan had ever built cars here at all. They've definitely had an impact on the Australian motoring scene. They're beloved here, but at the same time, they're not really seen of as a core part of it. On top of that, you have to take into account the really cool stuff we didn't get here. We got the R31 Skyline, we got the R31 Pintara, very cool, but we didn't get the R32, anything after that Skyline-wise. We didn't get the Silvia, we didn't get the 180SX. We got the S15, but a lot of the really cool stuff, you know, it all came over to Australia as grey imports. It wasn't something that Nissan was offering as part of its core offering. So fundamentally, a very cool brand, one that I identify with a lot less today than I certainly used to. And also a brand that, as far as cheap cars go, as you probably saw today, it's about, you know, 8 Pulsars, 3 X-Trails, and maybe a Maxima or a Bluebird. Anyway, till next time, TK out.